Okay, good morning. I won't get you to jump up and do exercises and all the stuff that some presenters do. I don't like it when I have to do it. This morning I'm just going to talk about a little bit of what's happening in the field of audio-visual. And so there'll be a little bit of stuff like HDR and UHD. I'll be talking a bit about Kordz and why Kordz cables should be recommended in the context of all this stuff. And I'll be chucking a whole lot of numbers at you, which I don't expect you to remember at this stage, but be aware of the fact that in the future these numbers will become very important. So I'll sort of explain all that. My name is Wolfgang Meyer, and I'm the sales agent for Kordz, as well as some other products. But as far as radio parts are concerned, it's Kordz. Our industry, you guys and us's, we supply the skills and the components to join things together, to connect devices to each other. These devices would be things like Blu-ray player, AV recorders, displays, all need to be connected. The main form of connectivity is still HDMI at this stage, one way or another. Keeping in mind that HD base T, which is the long length or extender version of HDMI, is still HDMI. It's not a different system, it is based on HDMI. You've got to put HDMI into it. Even if it's built into a device, behind it, there's still HDMI processing going on. The main alternative, I believe, in the future is going to be IP, Internet Protocol, Ethernet, if you like. It's not there yet because at the moment we're still mucking around with 1 gig Ethernet, and or gigabit Ethernet as it's called. There is a fair bit of 4 and 5 out there already. At the high end in the data field, they've gone as far as 45 gig. Everybody's getting ready for 80, and the fastest I've ever had out of Ethernet's been 114 gigabits per second on IP. And IP, of course, is terrific because it uses checksum, which means that if there's an error in a packet of data, it can be retransmitted. Whereas with HDMI, when it comes out the other end, that's what you get. They've got a few things in there to try and reduce the problems, but at the end of the day, you get what you get, and that's it. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. We don't have any control over what the consumer electronics companies, like what the CEA, Consumer Electronics Association, what they do. You know, when they make these things in their projectors and whatever, if it's no good, it's no good. We have to deal with it. They won't. That's our problem. In terms of it's the installer's problem primarily, but I get the phone calls as well. Hey, this isn't working. So that's all of our problem. A lot of these problems are due to bad implementation of HDMI on the part of the CA people. Their ports on their TVs and projectors, perhaps not so much projectors but TVs, in some cases are quite horrible. Very poor performance, and we somehow have to deal with. They say, oh, we've got this error allowable, but forgetting they've also got that error at that end, and then the intermediate bit is being pushed to its limits anyway, and no wonder they have problems, or we get bad quality pictures and so on. I believe that most of the problems are due to cost cutting. They're definitely trying to get their TVs especially down in price, so they get 4K rolling, this sort of thing, and they're cutting costs on things like their ports, which are actually very important, but they don't understand that. We know for an absolute certainty that there's an overwhelming lack of understanding of HDMI on the parts of the box manufacturers, because we have been consulted at times and been amazed at just how little they understood. And this is senior engineers from people like Samsung and so on. We also believe that there's a need for CEDIA or some organisation to have representation on the HDMI forum. They're the people that set the standards, the forum. And at the moment, they're all manufacturers and they're content makers, people who make movies and this sort of thing. But there's no representation from the installation industry at all. In other words, it's virtually being disregarded. And that's not doing them any good, and it makes life difficult for us. So what are our new challenges? They all come down to Ultra HD. Now, you guys, have you got 4K TVs and this sort of stuff? Okay. At the moment, there actually isn't a problem. I'm talking about next year, or maybe the year after, when we're going to start seeing problems with this. The CE name, the consumer electronics industry, call Ultra HD or 2160p. They call it Ultra HD, which is a good name for it because it follows on from the full high definition, FHD, which was 1080p. We believe they should have called it 2160p, consistent with that, but they call it UHD. Unfortunately, it has been called 4K, which isn't actually really very right, because the consumer version, which are all the TVs and things out there, and most projectors are actually 3840 pixels by 2160, so we should really call it 3.8K. The cinema version is in fact 4000 pixels, 4096, and yes, that is 4K, and that's where the term originated. It was in the cinema industry, not in the residential industry. But everybody knows what we mean when we say 4K, so I'll continue to use the term. 4K Basic was described by HDMI version 1.4 back in 2008. It is not a new thing. In 2008, we knew what it was all about. We knew what the specifications were going to be, and I saw my first 4K TV at the CDS show in Gold Coast in 2008. Panasonic had a 101-inch panel, which was 4K. For 2 years now, they have been showing 8K TVs at various shows. But basically, it was the specification there was for 2160p at 60 Hertz, 8-bit colour, which is basic colour, a 420 chroma, which is a colour compression system. You familiar with component colour, chroma, subsampling, this sort of thing? Okay. Bottom line is it's 4 pixels by 4 pixels. All 4 pixels are that's the Y, which is the black and white component of the picture, which is your definition, okay? And then the colours are then compressed because our eyes are not very good with colour, and it's not necessary to actually have fully uncompressed colour. It's excessive to a requirement for the human eye. So traditionally we've had this sort of compression system. As the resolution gets bigger and bigger, there is an argument that says we really need to go for uncompressed colour. But if you go from 420 to 444 uncompressed, you're doubling the amount of colour information you're presenting. So it's a massive increase in the data rate if they do that. But this is what was described in 2008. The silicon for it to do it wasn't available until 2012. Now, this basically meant that this was an 8.9 gigabits per second, okay, or 9 gigabits per second. Some people call it rounded off, and that's fairly important to know that. Now, also, the old 3D deep colour capability that we had under 1.4 was also 8.91. So 4K and 1080p at its best was the same bit rate. Okay, and that was done deliberately. The basic 1080p was 2.2. Okay, that's a way less, that's only a quarter the bit rate, and this was described as standard HDMI. Unfortunately, there was a lot of cables that were produced that passed basic 1080p, and it was declared to be high speed, which is quite wrong. I'll point out why. Now, the specification for high speed was in fact 10.2. Okay. Now, 10.2, we were actually using 9. All these, even the 4K standard was for 9, and yet the cable had to reliably pass 10.2 to be called high speed. And what this gave us was you could argue that standard could in fact pass basic 4K, a standard cable. Okay, and a lot of people sort of really have had a lot of problem with this standard and high speed thing, and I think it was not a very good way of doing things. They tried to simplify it, but they oversimplified it to the point of confusion. The difference between the actual and the theoretical standard was to give us headroom to cover for losses due to things like wall plates, bad sockets in the devices, insertion losses like EMI and bending of the cable and all sort of things that create a loss along the way. So that was actually a good idea. So you have a cable which can do at least 10.2 to cover 9, and that worked. And that's what made a genuine high-speed cable work in most situations where perhaps other cables didn't. Now, our cables are independently tested to comply with HDMI specifications per HDMI licensing. So we've actually had to pay a laboratory to test our cables to HDMI licensing standards to confirm that they're reasonably robust and that they can reliably pass 10.2. Okay. There's only one other brand of cable that's done that. They're also mechanically superior. They're less sensitive to abuse, and above all they fit without a locking mechanism. Now, one of our major competitors out there in commercial land is one that has a little lock system built in. You put the thing in, you lock it, and it won't come out, which is a good thing. You don't want the cable to fall out or come loose. Problem is, it mechanically distorts the socket, and after a while, with it getting hotter and colder, hot and cold, hot and cold, it no longer is tight. The socket's distorted, and it can still fall out anyway. The other problem with them is that if it's locked in place securely and somebody comes along and wants to move something, wants to pull the socket out, tug, and the insides are on the outside. Okay, so there's a lot of damage done out there by people pulling on locking plugs. We also do things like our X series. We have double insulation, special soldering techniques. We have so basically it's a die cast connector, etc. We've gone to a lot of trouble with those. It makes it very expensive, but does also make it incredibly reliable and pretty well bulletproof. Now, as far as going back to this 10.2 gig, what are the other benefits of having genuine high speed? And the thing is that this 10.2 is a minimum requirement. It's not a maximum. It has to be able to do at least. So we can do better than 10.2. Is it necessary? Well, we say it will be soon. Now, at the moment, 4K has been 9, so we haven't had to go better than 10, other than to allow for losses. So what's happening as we go past the basic 4K that we had in 2008, the next step is an 11 gigabit, which puts us over the 10, of course, and this allows for 2060p, 24 frames per second, 444 uncompressed and 10-bit colour. Now we say that, in fact we know that we can do this with our high-speed cable. 14 gigs, actually it said 13.37. This allows us to go for deeper colour or higher frame rates, and good short cables could still manage this. Then we go to what it's all about, has been all about, and will be before too long, which is 18 gig. 18 gig is going to be the new catch cry, because the expectation is that we will have 60 hertz and 10-bit and perhaps 422 or 420. When HDMI were approached and sort of said, hey guys, this high speed thing isn't going to cut it, because they said, oh, high speed will still do it. And we say, no, it won't. After a lot of humming and hawing, I said, okay, we'll have a new standard called premium. So standard HDMI, high speed and premium is proposed. Now everybody's looked at that, all the manufacturers, and said, okay, what's involved? And it costs about $2,000 to have each cable. You need each length independently tested, which is ridiculous, and we're not going to do it. And as far as we know, no other manufacturer is going to do it. So I don't expect to see the premium label applied anytime soon to anything. Unless, of course, it hasn't been tested, in which case I think there might be some legal action if they do it. So what we've decided to do independently of other people is we're going to test our products for what they will actually do. So is it 422 will actually pass 4.45, which is the next sort of step up. Will it do 11.14, 14 or 18? And we're going to sort of put that on our packaging, or at least supply a chart to give you an indication of it. Now this means that installers are really going to have to know what the data rate is that they're going to be passing, in the same way that the IP people doing networking, really have to know what sort of data is going to be transmitted. So we're basically going to have some charts out. We've started testing so that we know exactly what each cable can do, and then if people say, well look, our requirement is for blah blah blah, we'll say, well this will do it, and we'll send you a chart. As I said before, Ethernet's always done this. No confusing names, you know, standard, high speed, premium, what's it mean? So we simply say, okay, we know this will do 18 gig, or we know this will do 9. Now, the new generation of UHD, the first thing that comes up with it is we've now introduced HDCP 2.2. This is high definition digital content protection. You're familiar with HDCP? Okay. When we heard that this was coming out about a year ago, everybody was worried and everybody was getting their knickers in a knot, worrying about the problems it's going to give. It hasn't given any problems because it is limited only to 4K content, and only devices that can handle 4K content is it applicable to, and they all have it. Okay. So you buy the new Samsung Blu-ray player, the UHD Blu-ray player. Has anybody got one here? Played with it? You got one? Okay. Yeah, we got one at work just to play with. And it got some very interesting. We tested it with meters and saw some interesting stuff. Now, HDCP 2.2 only applies to 4K. It's not backwards compatible. So if you, how I'll put this, the alternative to that is the 1.4. 2.2 was introduced when HDMI 2.0 came out. It wasn't HDCP 2.0 because DisplayPort got in the first two updates, because DisplayPorts are way ahead of HDMI in terms of pretty much everything. DisplayPort is a vastly superior system, and it's just getting better and better. They're getting ready for 40 gig already in DisplayPort. Unfortunately, these things, the IT industry uses it, computers, but not the AV industry. They own HDMI, so they're not going to move away from it, so we're stuck with it. Whether we like it or not, we're stuck with it. It's not backwards compatible, it requires special hardware, but then again, it's only a problem if you have an early 4K TV, which doesn't have 2.2, and then you buy yourself a UHD Blu-ray player. You're not going to be able to play the discs because the discs are protected with 2.2. That's it. You can't do it. But the good thing is it doesn't add to the bit rate. So it's not going to provide any problems in terms of interconnectivity. HDR, this is the new buzzword. We've heard it first a bit over a year ago, maybe 18 months. What is it? You guys familiar with HDR? All of you, or some of you? Or? Okay, sort of. Okay, I'll just go over briefly. Is it any good? Is it a problem? Does it add to the bit rate? What it gives you is increased detail and colour in both the bright and the dark areas. Now, shouldn't confuse this with contrast. Contrast basically makes dark darker and light lighter. but it doesn't sort of fill in all the intermediate stages. Okay. For example, this is a photo. The exposure here is for the, there's my little button, is basically for the portico area here. But the dome and everything around it has been underexposed. When you expose for the dome and the surrounding buildings, the portico is already too light, too bright. And you can just see that there's something else in the background. Here we've exposed for the background buildings, but the foreground building is too bright. There it's basically all too much. But if you combine those, the light and the dark, the correct areas, correct there, correct there, correct there, you get a nice picture which is sort of consistent with the way our eyes see things. So this is aimed at our vision, human vision. Okay. HDR has been around forever. I was in the second year of high school when I took up photography and printing. And that was just black and white printing, and there was always this problem, I want some detail in the shadow here, the light areas are too light, so you used to do dodging and burning under the enlarger, and you try and use different developers and different papers, sort of, it was always we were chasing the appropriate dynamic range. Sometimes you want a small dynamic range, because you perhaps want all shadows and just a few little highlights here and there. Other times you want it all to be very even. In the movies, of course, they've had to deal with this forever, so they use lighting because they can't do dodging and burning and this sort of thing before Photoshop. So they light things, so they have big lights, reflectors, and everything else to give the light balance in the shot where you can see what they want you to see. Okay, so they're building the dynamic range externally before the image itself is captured. But then it still has to be reproduced, so if it's going to be projected as a film, the film itself has to be able to reproduce all of that as well. So there's a lot of technical work in there. That's why movies have a director of photography, and his job basically is to control the dynamic range. That's his primary job. Okay. Where you point it and everything else, that's a director's job. But the DOP, he says use this emulsion, this amount of lighting, we'll move this there, we'll move that there, runs around with a light meter and everything else. And this is what we've always been chasing. This dates back to the 1860s when it first became an issue. So it's nothing new, it's just we're finally getting it in our televisions. I have seen HDR on a 4K panel that's been calibrated for HDR, okay, and not SDR. Okay, we've had calibration of TV panels, which has always improved the picture, always, for standard dynamic range, but now with HDR, it's done differently. And so when you see that and a good shot, it's unbelievable. It looks almost 3D, so deep and vibrant. Just makes you feel good just looking at it. Unfortunately, the reality is that most TV panels out there are displaying below what they're capable. Okay, I walk into somebody's place and you see the TV and you say, oh, it's good TV, but the picture's not there, just not performing. Okay, most people don't see or appreciate the quality, perhaps because they've never seen it, because the people who are selling TVs aren't displaying them properly. I worked for Harvey Norman for a while, and I hit my head against a brick wall trying to get them to set up a TV, say this is what's possible on any TV. But no, don't worry about it. And of course, the CE manufacturers, the eternal bad guys, are muddying the waters a bit as well. I shall explain. For the moment, HDR is limited only to 4K, which is the content, the disc, if you like, or the stream, the player, and the output device. All have to be HDR to get HDR. But they also need to be the same HDR system. So guess what? We've got different HDR systems. And who would have thought? Yeah. At the moment, there are 3-ish versions of HDR. HDR started from Dolby. They were the first to work on it, which is understandable because they're all about quality. The CE manufacturers varied this a bit and formed HDR10, which is the most common system in use at the moment. If you buy a Blu-ray with HDR on it, it'll be HDR10. And then there are several broadcast systems where different broadcasters are working independently on HDR systems. Okay, so we've got the BBC's working on it, the Europeans are working on it, the Japanese are working as well.
Netflix has HDR on some of its content overseas as well. Do you know if they're using any of these in particular, or their own variety again?
I don't know which ones they're using. I've been trying to find out. I've got a contact in the US who's right into this and calibration and everything else, and he told me that he watched the Olympics, or the closing ceremony of the Olympics, from Netflix on HDR, on a set he'd calibrated himself, and he said it just blew his socks off. It was just so good, because it was transmitted. They did transmit 4K to several sources. What they're using of those, I'm not too sure. It'd be nice if it was HDR10, but broadcast has its own problems, and streaming isn't really. Broadcast is mostly terrestrial. You know, something you pick up at the moment through your TV antenna that has its own problems. As soon as you run it over a cable, it's a different kettle of fish. Okay. Now, the official spec for HDR10 is basically all the same as UHD 4K, but with 10-bit colour. Okay, you just need that extra colour depth to get the most of it. Dolby have gone further, and theirs is 12-bit. So having 10-bit rather than 8 only adds 25% to the bit rate, which isn't a lot. Okay, so that shouldn't be a problem. It's used mostly with Blu-ray players at this point. Like I said, I don't know what Netflix are doing and the various others. So we say it's not a problem, HDR. In itself, HDR adds nothing to the bit rate except the extra colour, that's all. Now, Blu-ray. I'd have to say if I had longer hair, I would have pulled it out, because I was doing a lot of testing and I was getting all sorts of weird stuff coming up. Nothing what I was expecting. Now, the official spec for Blu-ray, as it was put out by the Blu-ray Consortium, which took 4 years to do this, ridiculously. Their spec was for 13.37 gigabits, or 14 gigabit. Okay, 2160p, 60 frames, 420 chroma, 10-bit, and a new type of compression called H.265. It has actually been around a couple of years, but we knew that they were going to use this compression. It's a near lossless, very high level of compression. The old compression used on the old Blu-rays was H.264, which used an earlier version of MPEG-2. And it's a very good compression system and, of course, facility for HDR. But this is where the problem is, the 265, or HVEC as they call it. What's happening is they're doing 24 frames a second, saying, oh well, that's what the director filmed it in, that's what he wanted. That's their excuse. The chroma pull down, uncompressed, and 420, everybody agreed was going to be plenty good enough. And they've gone 444, and in 10-bit they're giving us 8. Okay, so why is it so? Shall I go back? The reason is that they've had to do this, the 444, because H.265 measures or processes the chroma pull down in a different way, and none of the TVs out there can do H.265 chroma. So they have to send an uncompressed colour unnecessarily to the TV so they can process the colour, because 265 does it differently. Okay, there are actually quite a few different ways of doing this. It took us, I think David worked on this for almost a year, to try and find out why, and he's finally worked it out, and he's actually written a white paper for CEDIA on it, and that's what's been determined. Now, because of the fact they're pretty much doubling the bit rate by going to 444, they've really had to cut the 60 frame back to 24, even though 60 is needed. Okay, but there's another problem with 60, of course. Most of the TVs have cheap processors. The processors just aren't good enough to do it. 4K and 60 frames a second. That's a lot of data that has to be crunched. It means you need a more powerful processor, which Sony are now doing. Nobody else has done it, but Sony got a new, I think called a V3 or something. And they've sort of gone for 8-bit. And what that actually gives us is that it is 8.9. So if you run your UHD Blu-ray player into a 4K TV, you can do what you've always done. It's under 10 gig, you can use a high-speed cable and there's no problems. However, everybody agrees they have to go to 60 hertz and, or 50 hertz in Australia. In fact, it could be argued that 120 is the optimum. Google recently bought a virtual reality system for several $1 billion, and it has 3D VR, and it runs at 72 frames a second because they determined that was the absolute minimum that was possible when you got that sitting there and it's 3D, and that was a minimum, not the optimum. Okay, so every time you go, if you go from 50 to 72, there's not a 50% increase in data rate, more processing needed, etc. But you do get better and better pictures. When that happens, we'll get 3D in 4K as well, and it'll work. Unlike at the moment, where they have an effective 25 frame a second, which is just nowhere near enough. Even 48 frame a second it's a lot better, but it's still not good enough. In other words, we are heading very quickly towards 18 gig. Okay, 18 gig. And quite frankly, all the stuff out here isn't going to be able to handle it. But it does mean that for now we can still use HD base T. HD base T, by the silicon in it, is limited to 10.2 gigabits per second. 2 years ago at Infocom in Florida, the engineers told us that, yes, we're right on the verge of being able to crack the 10.2, we're going to give you 18 gig, just around the corner, just around the corner. 2 years later, I was speaking to a guy at Valens recently in Israel who make HD base T, and he tells me it'll be 3 years before they do it. Okay, so for now, HD base T 10.2, as soon as we go over 10.2, we will not be able to use HD base T anymore. And like I said, 3 years away for the 18 gig solution. They may take the next step and go to 40. At the moment, Valens are focusing on automotive control and virtual reality. Yes?
When you say that the 18 gig HD base T is 3 years away, are they actually going to pursue HD base T to its full extent, as opposed to IP?
My feeling is that they'd be pretty silly too. I do believe the future is IP, as I'm going to point out in a moment. They're saying 18 gig over copper and 40 gig over fibre optic, but I believe it when I see it. They've put it on the back burner. They've tried different things. They've put it out there to ask engineers and leading engineers in the industry to come up with a solution. The guy we know, Jack, in Toronto, he developed our Neo system that we had. A clever lad. He came up with 2 chips and 2 cables and electronics to join them together. And it did work out to 40 metres, 18 gig. But the cost was horrendous because these chips cost a lot. And everybody sort of said, nah, we're not going to run with it. It's not the solution. It's not the copper that's the problem, it's the silicon. And the fact of the matter is we do need 18 gig. There will be HDMI over fibre optic available very shortly, I would think, that actually works. There's a number of systems out there at the moment we've been testing. I think I've tested 4 different ones, and none of them will do 18, that they will do 1080. I suspect it's more to do, not so much the silicon they're using, but the way they're terminating the fibre optics. I don't think they know how to terminate fibre optics because it's not easy. Okay, it's something I'm not educated in either, but I've got to educate myself on it. But I'm sure it's always the terminations. You know, once you get into everything being right, that's why our cables work, is because the terminations are so good. The cable itself is not a huge big thing. It's its determination. And I think it's where the problem is. So at the moment they're making good money out of their automotive control, where they're running a single Cat6 cable from the front computer to the back computer. They control everything in the back of the car, AV, rear sensors, lights, everything. And they've got a VR connectivity solution, which is a really skinny little wire, which replaces a lot of thicker wires, sort of hanging off there. You don't want weight and stuff on your mask. And I've got the twisted pairs now at 40 gauge. So they're really, really skinny. So yeah, they're very clever people, Balens. So what's happening? HDMI will remain as a system, if for no other reason than the fact that it belongs to the CE manufacturer, so they're going to continue using their system for the foreseeable future. Okay. At the moment, HDMI uncompressed over IP has potential. It's not just potential; it actually works. I've seen it. Okay, I think in Amsterdam in February there was quite a few well-known manufacturers, and they were showing solutions, and they were running 100 metres of 18 gig over twin fibre optic, and it was fabulous. But the thing is, the cheapest system I saw was about $3,000. Okay, so it's not a residential product yet. The price of all of this stuff will come down, and the good thing about IP, of course, is that you've got packets of data, you've got checksum, you've got the ability to repeat faulty data, and it's where all the work's happening, and it's been driven by the data people, not by the AV industry, which is relatively small, but data. You know, there's data centres out there, they're like a huge big factory, and all they are is just racks as far as the eye can see with cables coming out. And they're the people that are driving, okay? They're driving. At the moment, we are presuming here everything's gigabit Ethernet, 1 gig, just one little gig. If you're going to run HDMI over that, you have to compress it massively. As soon as you compress, you're going to have problems with synchronization, with latency, as they call it. Because of compression, uncompression, plus data going backwards and all that sort of stuff. 5 gig is still not going to be enough. Really, we're going to need 45 gig Ethernet to be fairly common, and for you'd probably get Ethernet switches in the home which can handle 45 gig, and then the whole place can be wired for AV as well as super fast internet, which of course the NBN isn't going to deliver. As I said, currently it's hugely expensive. There is potential for 100. The fastest Ethernet there's ever been so far has been 114 gigabit.
That's why Mike, our boss here, is so keen on fibre, our next generation of cables, and making sure that we've got things available rather than Cat 8 or whatever other standards coming out after it, which is still trying to follow up and trying to get even close to fibre.
Yeah, I've been doing, for the last year, I've been doing a lot of research into fibre. I think we all have. Kordz are building a relationship with a manufacturer in China who's been doing the assembly of our cables, and they have a factory in Japan which makes fibre. They've sent us some samples and they're rubbish. They just didn't know how to do it. I personally, as things stand at the moment, I've been to all the shows, talked to a lot of people, I would say that it's going to be twin fibre. Yeah, it can be just in a single wire, and it doesn't have to be separate little things. Twin and probably multi-mode. It has to be multi-mode if it's only 2, and a good level of transparency in the cable. At the moment, they've been using cheaper cables, and they haven't been bright enough. And as soon as you put a little bit of a bend in them, they cease to function because of reflections inside the cable itself.
So, what would the advantage of high-speed HD-based T be over IP? Like, why are they investing time and energy into developing it?
Well, the thing is that it's going to be more than 3 years before we see 20 or 45 gig Ethernet being readily available, especially for residential use.
But I mean, like, they wouldn't go to Ethernet anyway, like, it would just be fibre.
They would use fibre instead of copper.
Yeah,
It's still Ethernet. It's just
Yeah, they're talking about copper at the moment. I don't think they'll be able to do it with copper because
okay.
copper has a problem. There are certain.
Sorry, I misunderstood when you said Ethernet. I thought you meant fibre.
I meant what?
I
Cable.
thought you meant copper.
Copper. No. Ethernet is just a system. Most Ethernet out there in the commercial world is fibre optic.
Yeah, I misunderstood.
These big centres out there, they're all fibre optic these days. They don't bother with copper. There are problems with copper capacitance, for example. And the thing about capacitance is capacitance creates cliffs at certain frequencies. Okay. In the olden days, wireless radios that people used to listen to, had tuners in them. They were capacitors. They were air capacitors, and they actually varied the amount of surface area of plates that were opposite each other, and they could tune, and they could select a frequency that was being transmitted to a particular station, all at their own frequencies. They still do actually, and they use capacitors to block off the other frequencies. So capacitance, which is present in any insulated wire, because the insulator is what capacitors use. At a particular frequency, there'll be a cliff. It'll just go boom. Okay, and that capacity depends on the length and the characteristics and everything else. So there'll be certain lengths of cable as the frequencies go up where there's simply going to be cliffs. It's just not going to happen. Okay, so you'll be able to send this amount of data over, this amount of data, but not that amount of data, because it'll fall off the cliff because of the capacitance characteristics of the wire. So I don't see how there's a future for copper for high-end use. And I think fibre it's more sort of future-proof and everything else. It's just that we're not quite there yet at the lower end of the scale. And I've tested a lot of stuff. And then, like I said, none of the stuff I've tested has done 18 gig. Some of it has worked at a bit over 10, but not beyond that.
Keep in mind when you're talking about IP and Internet, Ethernet and the rest of it, a lot of that's based around the routers and switches and the management side of things too. So any of your AV installers that think they can just run a cable through a wall, in future they're going to need to know the software side of it as well to make this work properly too.
I just don't fully understand why
HD based T.
isn't just going to buy. Like,
it might, but it's as a point-to-point solution for a lot of people, it's easy. It's just plug in this cable into these boxes, plug in the power. Yeah, you can.
Well, that's what is happening at the moment, because you've got to remember that HDMI is 4 twisted pairs plus another 3 wires to do the DDC stuff and a series of earths. Okay, so they're doing what is basically taking 19 connections on HDMI cable. They're doing it with 4 twisted pairs, which is only 8. So what they're doing is they're combining signals using a modulation system, so that one signal is embedded within the other signal and then separated. They're doing all of that with 8 pieces of wire instead of 19. So with fibre optic, if you're sending it over a single multi-mode optical fibre, you're doing all of that over in just one device. So you're modulating everything together and virtually running it serially down the system.
My old professor at uni used to describe it like a hose that you're putting 19 or say 20 different temperatures of water down the same pipe at the same time and still being able to pull out each of those temperatures, bits of water at the other end after they'd all been combined together. Really lovely stuff. Yeah,
there are challenges. There are limitations in length with fibre optic, again depending on the material that's used. If it's a flexible material, you're limiting your range because it's never as optically pure.
Limiting like 10 metres or 100 metres?
They're talking about 18 gig for 50 to 100 metres.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Like
Yeah, but that's only 18 gig. Don't forget, we're staring in the face. I'm telling you, next year 18 gig, but we are staring in the face of 40 gig.
Yeah.
So HD, so they're working on 40 gig HD.
Well, 8K.
Yes, they are as well, but I don't know where. I wouldn't be surprised if they abandon it.
Yeah.
Because why is it 3 years away? They said, well, we've been working on it for 3 years and got nowhere. It'll take at least another 3 years. I think that's what somebody
Then they
said.
have to get it to market and everything, but everything's already on IP. I mean, in the States.
Well, IP at the moment
Yeah,
is...
no, they're just
They're just so invested, they're like, we put so much money into it, like, we need to make it work.
It's time to get rid of it.
Yeah, well, they're making good money out of these other things they're doing.
Yeah.
So what they're not is stupid, these people at Valance. They're right on the ball.
Sorry, we derailed you for a bit there.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think I might have pressed the wrong buttons too.
It's important knowledge to have. People are going to ask.
Okay. Now, like I said, we're looking at 40 for our future. You guys looking at 18 for your future and the immediate future. You don't need to worry about 2 or 3 years down the track. We do. Now, 4K was coming. Now it's here. I remember 2 years ago telling people it's in the tunnel. I can see the light. I can hear the sound. It's just about here, but it's here. We're struggling to cope with 18G because we haven't really got really good solutions. And 8K is coming. It'll be at least 40 gig. And but exactly how much compression they're going to allow and exactly what they're going to do or even how they're going to use it, we really don't know. We're talking about walls, video walls rather than TV sets with 8K. So
Was it the Olympics that NHK, the Japanese broadcaster, had a 15K system up and running? I think they were some way of multiplying and adding images together and the rest. They were using it on video walls in Tokyo and Shibuya and a few other places too.
they've been experimenting for 3 years with broadcast of 4 and 8K. They did do 8K from the Olympics, NHK did. USA streaming video in 4K and HDR has. The Olympics were shown, if you had facility for viewing it, because you need the appropriate HDR capability on your TV. So it was only invited people were invited to the thing. They broadcast 4K. They are working on 8K broadcast. They did have 22 channel sound with it as well. Keep in mind, HDMI 1.4 allows for 32 channels of sound. And again, nobody's taking advantage of that. They're all opportunities, but they're not doing it. Sony and Panasonic plan to have 8K display ready in the retail sector for general sale by the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Okay, so they're obviously planning, well, NHK will be transmitting 8K, and they're probably planning on picking up on that, I would think. It's because it's not a coincidence they're saying we'll have it for the 2020 Olympics and they're in Tokyo, and that's where the 8K stuff's been happening. I've seen the new standards for 8K broadcasts for Europe. They've already put them out there. Some of them, they say, still to be determined, but the broad outline of what they're planning for 8K broadcast is already there in document form. Okay, we haven't even got 1080p broadcast here, have we? We're lucky if we get 1080i on Foxtel. Can we future-proof new installations? Of course we can't. Can we do future resistance? Yeah. You're supplying somebody 18G, say, well, we're offering you a degree of future resistance with this, so that as things get upgraded, you don't have to have new stuff put in the walls. So you have to start thinking in terms of 18G and the best interconnects. Now, how do I go for time with that?
Yeah, really well.
Okay.
Yep. Well done, Wolfgang.
Thank you. Now, any questions?